Congratulations, DawgNation. You've made it to the weekend. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger, and we are about to have ourselves some fun. Admittedly, I do love juicy rumors. I kind of like the soap opera around the SEC. We've got an example of that today, AL.com story on just how it came to pass that Scott Cochran landed at UGA. There are some very, very juicy quotes in all of this, and I think it sets up Georgia-Alabama to even be a bigger deal on the field when they play this September, and then possibly again after that in December. We'll tell you all of that. There is recruiting news today. Georgia has gotten itself a 2021 commit. We'll let Jeff Sintel tell us a lot about that. There's also some other twists and turns when it comes to the recruiting storylines. Jeff will cover a lot of those for us on the show here today. So it's going to be a great time, and I'm really glad to have you with us as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I went on the radio yesterday in Tuscaloosa. What could possibly go wrong there with that, right? After some of the things I've said about Alabama as of late. And one of the things the host asked me was, what do you think of the current state of the Georgia-Alabama rivalry? And I had to admit that I'm not quite sure what Georgia and Alabama has is a rivalry. They don't play necessarily enough for it to be a rivalry. Georgia hasn't beaten Alabama enough for it to be a rivalry. And when you think about Georgia compared to some of the other teams around the SEC, the backstory, the history, the tradition, there's not as much of that between Georgia and Alabama. What Georgia and Alabama have is not necessarily a rivalry. However, some of the things you've also seen play out over the course of the last 24 hours, I think suggests the fact that Georgia and Alabama may be something better than a rivalry. And I'll tell you what that is here coming up. Georgia's also gotten a 2021 commit today. We'll let Jeff Sintel tell us about that as well here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. Before I kind of get more into the Georgia-Alabama thing, though, I kind of set up some of the backstory. And I've told y'all before, I try to be a good person. I've given up on being a perfect person. One of the things that makes me imperfect is I love the soap operas that you sometimes get around the SEC. And for whatever reason, this league, this conference, compared to almost anything in college or professional sports, nothing produces that the way this league kind of produces that kind of stuff. And there's an example of that. AL.com, two good reporters, John Talty and Matt Zenitz, have written a backstory about how it is that Scott Cochran came to be employed by the University of Georgia. And some of the details that they cover, and I'll put a link to the story. You should read the entire thing. It's really good. But there's some of the stuff that they kind of touch on that's not as important, I think, to me. The fact that Cochran pursued a number of jobs, some of those in the NFL, the fact that Saban kind of worked hard to keep Cochran there at the end, and some of the things that Saban's kind of said about how the direction that Alabama's going to go with its strength and conditioning program now. For the most part, I'll kind of leave that alone, let you read that for yourself at the pages of AL.com. However, when it comes to setting up what I think is a really enhanced sense of bad blood between Georgia and Alabama, there are a couple of things from this story that I do think need to be pointed out. One of those is an accusation of sorts from Scott Cochran. Let me read this to you once again. John Talty, Matt Zenitz, I should say, the writers from AL.com, on the idea that Cochran wanted to leave and go be a coach somewhere else. This is the writers. If he was ever going to accomplish his goal of becoming a head coach, he knew he'd have to make the move out of the weight room, and Ole Miss represented a perfect opportunity to do so. You may have remembered some rumors. We addressed these briefly when they came up, that Cochran might go work with Lane Kiffin. Well, the AL.com writers go on to say, Cochran told those close to him he was in position to get the job at Ole Miss, and according to AL.com, outside forces intervened to squash the hire, according to sources. So Cochran told some people, those people told AL.com that Cochran was about to get a job at Ole Miss, and quote-unquote outside forces stepped in and kept Cochran from getting that job. Now listen, I'm not quite so sure that I want to speculate too much on who the outside sources are on this, but it's a pretty damning accusation on Cochran's part that somebody prevented him from getting a job, because those in coaching circles will tell you that's just not the kind of thing that happens all that frequently. It doesn't have it. I would say it almost never happens that some coach somewhere, some force somewhere prevents a guy from advancing professionally. But in Cochran's case, That's exactly what he says went on here, according to AL.com. Now, what makes this even more interesting is that Cochran does not have a history for this kind of drama. He doesn't have a history for this kind of, I'll use a big word, histrionics, kind of making a story bigger than it should be, embellishing that story. In fact, according to a guy that knows Cochran really well, his backstory and his history is almost the exact opposite of that. Scott Cochran in the past has been praised for how forthright he's been, including a former Alabama All-American, Mike Johnson, who was on our show last week. Here is what Johnson said about Cochran then, relevant because of what Cochran's apparently saying now. Here's Johnson on Cochran.
He was always involved in special teams. I think that's what a lot of people don't understand right now. He was the kind of guy holding up scout team cards. He helped out with special teams during practice. I think that's why Kirby sees what he was doing in Tuscaloosa and feels comfortable moving him into that role.
So, very interesting. Actually, I think I may have sent that in the wrong order. We have another Johnson clip we can play there on that. Let me let you hear a different Johnson clip on this. Here's Mike Johnson on Scott Cochran.
He's an authentic person. He's not going to, BS with you. He's going to tell you how it is. He's going to tell you how he feels. He's going to tell you what you need to do to be great. And I think that's why so many guys connected with him. There was no facade. You talked about the offseason. For all intents and purposes, he was the off-season head coach at Alabama. I mean, you don't see Nick Saban on a day-to-day basis when you're down in the weight room, when you're running sprints. It's Scott Cochran. When Nick Saban is off recruiting or when some of those coaches have off time during the summer, it's Scott Cochran. I mean, he is the head coach and kind of the go-between, and I think his personality just allows him to kind of develop those relationships with players. That he's just an authentic person. I think that's why Kirby feels very comfortable in moving him to a role like special teams, because he can touch every position group on the team and continue to develop those relationships much in the same way he did as a strength coach.
So think about this for a moment. A guy that a former Alabama player just profusely praised for his authenticity has said that he was close to getting a job at Ole Miss in a similar role to what he's now at Georgia, but outside forces intervened to squash the hire. Now, in this same AL.com story, there are sources that dispute that part of it. But as Mike Johnson says, Cochran's got a history of showing a great deal of authenticity with how he deals with people. So take that for what it's worth. Also, when you hear Mike describe in really stark terms just how important Cochran was to the Alabama program, essentially the head coach of the offseason, as Mike Johnson says it is, it becomes a little easier to understand why someone might step in to squash him from going to a place like Ole Miss if you had the power to do that. But as this AL.com story goes on to kind of tell in great detail, Cochran wanted to be a coach, eventually wants to be a head coach, and knew he was going to have to grow out of the strength and conditioning role to do that, and had his eye apparently on special teams. Let me read you then a couple more sentences from the story, because here's where things also get interesting between the relationship between Cochran and Alabama coach Nick Saban. So according to John Talty, Matt Zenitz, Nick Saban told him he wouldn't be comfortable hiring him as an on-field assistant at that point in time, according to sources with knowledge of the situation. The advice from Saban was that if Cochran wanted to become a special teams coach, he should start attending Alabama special teams meetings and invest time into learning the intricacies of the position. AL.com goes on to say that Cochran left the conversation upset and convinced he wouldn't be getting an on-field opportunity at Alabama, given he believed he'd already spent a lot of time around special teams. Once again, that's John Talty, Matt Zenitz, writing together for AL.com. And on that note, once again, Mike Johnson, when he was on the show last week, also made it clear that behind the scenes, much the same way that Cochran believed was true, Johnson also believes that his special teams experience was a little more significant than maybe he's been given credit for. Let me let you hear Mike on that.
He was always involved in special teams. I think that's what a lot of people don't understand right now. He was the kind of guy holding up scout team cards. He helped out with special teams during practice. I think that's why Kirby sees what he was doing in Tuscaloosa and feels comfortable moving him into that role.
So, by the way, if you hear Mike Johnson on that and you say, well, yeah, he's a former Alabama player, he's still close to Cochran like so many guys are, that maybe he would be motivated to sort of support his guy because he feels close to a Scott Cochran. It's important to note that just this past week, or I should say just this week on DawgNation Daily, 2 days ago, we had someone completely different, Chuck Smith, who did not play football at Alabama. He played at Tennessee. He's not necessarily the kind of guy that spent a ton of time with Scott Cochran, although he has spent some time with him. They are now friends because they have the same agent. But a non-Alabama source also said some pretty similar things about Cochran's experience when it comes to special teams. Let me let you hear Chuck Smith on that.
I think it's an easy transition, strength and conditioning coach's job. It's very detailed. It's you put in a lot of work. You're dealing with the kids more than the coaches do. But I think as far as Scott's concerned, I mean, he's been around the brightest minds in football for the last, 17 years or however long he's been with Nick. I just think it's an easy transition because he's a guy who's smart. He studies. He is really a student of the game. But I think people put a little too much stock into longevity experience. You see coaches now that don't have even as much credibility or the experience as a guy like Scott. To me, it's going to be a seamless transition. I think he's going to be great. I think he's well-versed. And I can just tell you this, the guy didn't come out of a weight room office and just say, I'm going to be a special teams coach. This has been planned. He's put in the work. Clearly, Kirby and him are on the same page with an understanding. He's an asset. He's just not a fill-in.
So I think there are two really important points to unpack from all this really quickly. Nick Saban looked at Scott Cochran, according to AL.com, and said, you're not worthy of being a special teams coach here. Yet Chuck Smith, a former NFL player, former SEC great, a guy that spends a lot of time around football, still says that Cochran had been working and planning and preparing for this moment for quite some time. And yet for Saban, that still wasn't good enough. Mike Johnson says that during his time playing in Alabama, Scott Cochran was more involved during the special teams portion of practice than people realized, that he was ready for this opportunity, and Kirby knew that. The fact that Saban wasn't willing to give the professional respect to a guy like this to help him advance in his career, I think is a really bad look for Nick Saban. I do not think that Saban comes across looking particularly good in this situation. But beyond that, when you see in the pages of AL.com someone like Cochran say, I was prevented from getting a job at Ole Miss, or what Nick Saban alluded to when the new strength and conditioning coach was hired, that injury prevention was going to be a part of the new guy's role, essentially insinuating that Cochran had played a role in some of the high-profile injuries Alabama suffered the last couple of years. Those are a lot of accusations being thrown around right now. These two teams play in September, and when they do, there will be a lot of animosity, a lot of bad blood. I got to be honest with you. That makes it kind of fun for me. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. Good to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or on the radio at noon. Normally we are. Today we are preempted. Lady Dogs got a big win in the SEC tournament. They now play one of the real powers in the SEC, South Carolina, today. That's a noon start for the Lady Dogs in the SEC tournament, so we'll be cheering on Joni Taylor's team, and preempted on the radio on 960 The Rep because of that. And available as a podcast. And I'm now very proud to say, truly, wherever you find them. I've been saying that for a while. The honest truth is we had a kind of a big hole in our resume. We weren't on Spotify. Now, I know I bragged about this yesterday. Hey, we're on Spotify now. Some of you reached out and said, no, BA, you're not. I couldn't find you. I have been told that has been rectified. That situation has been taken care of. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, does live today on Spotify. So for those of you that get your podcasts that way, we certainly appreciate that, and we'll make that available for you. We're, for the most part, platform agnostic around here. We don't care if you watch, you listen, you whatever you do. We just hope you're able to find us somehow, and we keep trying to make as many different avenues for you to be able to do that. And by the way, we would not be able to do it without our friends at Kroger. Huge thanks to them for everything they do, and what a cool thing they're doing right now, because we're coming up on March 8th, which is International Women's Day, and Kroger's going to be brightening everyone's day that day. Bouquets just for her starting at $9.99. So celebrate International Women's Day with the special women in your life with a bouquet from Kroger starting at just $9.99. One of the fun things we've done over the last couple of days is we've been doing a BA Q&A. It's kind of a chance for you to weigh in on the hot topics of the day. I'm always curious of your opinions. We'll give you a chance to kind of weigh in on some of these. I'll even ask Jeff Santel about these when he joins a little bit later on. So question number one today, as far as our BA Q&A, reach out to me on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. Drop a live comment to our video comment section. Post a comment when I post the podcast at DawgNation.com. Pretty much however you want to access it. Here's question number one. Based on the description that's been laid out, Cochran ready to advance, Nick Saban not willing to allow that to happen in Alabama, do you think, as I do, that Nick Saban did Scott Cochran wrong? I'd love to hear from you on that today. Also, who do you think the most interesting SEC coach is? I've got a reason I'm going to ask this. I'll explain it more in greater detail later. But who's your most interesting SEC coach? And which 2020 recruit do you wish that Georgia would have signed that it didn't sign? There's a reason I'm asking this as well, which I'll also explain later. those are our BA Q&A questions for today. Drop those in no matter how you access the program, via Twitter, on the live comments, or at the podcast platform at DawgNation.com. I'd love to hear from you on that. For a minute, though, before we get Jeff Sintel, let me go around the doghouse. I'm not going to keep this Georgia-Alabama talk going here for a moment, because what has played out in the last 24 hours, accusations by Scott Cochran against somebody, we're not clear about that, but we can kind of read into it, suggestions by Nick Saban about Cochran, about maybe what he was not doing as strength and conditioning coach at Alabama, this would appear to be sort of an increased level of bad blood between these two programs. And that's not the only stuff that's been going back and forth between these two teams over the last few years. Do you remember the other day I played you a piece of audio? Aaron Suttles, who covers Alabama for one of the pay sites, The Athletic, also a radio host in WJOX in Birmingham. He went on a radio show in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, around the time that Scott Cochran was hired, and also had kind of a very interesting suggestion of maybe what's at play here between Kirby and Saban over Cochran, and offered a reminder of kind of what has gone on in the past between these two. So in light of what we just talked about on the Cochran front between Saban and Kirby, this is also a relevant addendum to all that as well.
Huge news, and maybe it's the conspiracy theorist in me, but Georgia's had this position open for a while. Why are they taking him right in the middle of the fourth quarter program? Why are they taking him literally 3 or 4 weeks before the start of spring practice? It feels very calculated by Kirby Smart. It's not the first time he's done subterfuge with Alabama. He famously took the picture of their recruiting board and when he left Alabama and worked for Georgia and sent it to recruits to show them that, hey, you're not that high on Alabama's recruiting board.
Whoa.
Damn.
Wait, I never heard that, Aaron.
Damn, Aaron.
That's pretty damn greasy.
If it absolutely happens.
So I've said before, look, why is Kirby the greasy one in this story, to use the radio host's phrase? If Alabama's telling recruits something different what their board says, aren't they the greasy ones in this? But I'm not going to do that again. I've done that, that topic probably a million times already. The point is that there's a lot of backstory now between Georgia and Alabama. And as I said off the top of the program, I'm not quite so sure in the conventional sense that what Georgia and Alabama have is a rivalry. They don't play each other a ton, have not played each other through history all that much, and frankly, Georgia hasn't won enough head-to-head recently for this to be considered a rivalry. But what I do think these programs have now may actually be better than a rivalry. I want to introduce a word into our conversation that we probably don't talk about enough when it comes to college football. You see, I am I've said this a million times, I'm a child of like 80s professional wrestling. I grew up loving pro wrestling. I still love pro wrestling. I'm just kind of a pro wrestling guy all the way around. And there's a word that gets used in wrestling a lot that I think applies to Georgia and Alabama a lot more than a rivalry. Georgia and Alabama aren't rivals. This may not be a rivalry. What it is a feud. You know what a feud is in wrestling? So-and-so did something to some wrestler, some other wrestler tried to get revenge on him. Now they've got a backstory together. Now they're in a feud. And we all pay for the pay-per-view to watch them wrestle to settle their feud. And that's essentially how wrestling has been sold since like the beginning of time, I guess, certainly since I've been watching, which is going on a number of decades. So when Georgia and Alabama play this upcoming September, they're more than rivals, right? I think that Georgia and Florida are rivals. For the most part, they are just teams competing for the same thing. They want to be top in the SEC East. They want to have bragging rights against each other. There is not, though, a ton of backstory there necessarily. You know, Brenton Cox changed that a little bit. I think that Kirby and Mullen deep down don't like each other very much. But for the most part, Georgia and Florida are only rivals. Georgia and Auburn are only rivals. Georgia and Alabama, though, are feuding. All of a sudden, there's the, you did this to me, so therefore I did this to you, and then therefore I try to do this back to you. And in a way, isn't feuding so much more interesting? I mean, go to the Big Ten for a moment. Like look at Ohio State and Michigan. You know, they're rivals. Like you have the one school that won't mention the name of the other school. That's not the way things go in the SEC. Not only do the folks down here mention their opponent's name, they typically mention it in court filings, somebody suing somebody or something like that. That's the kind of backstory drama that we produce in the SEC. And right now, I think that Georgia and Alabama are right in the middle of that. There is some kind of juicy stuff here. There are some accusations back and forth. There's some legitimate hurt feelings. It's better than a rivalry. It's a feud. Georgia and Alabama have one of those right now, and I can't wait to watch them play here. All right, we don't have Jeff Sintel ready to go as of yet. We will get Jeff here coming up in just a moment. It's good to have you with us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll figure out where Jeff is. Georgia did get a recruit today, a commitment from a 2021 defensive lineman. I want to learn more from Jeff on that. Marlon Dean's his name. I guess the cool thing to know about Dean kind of right away is he hails from Elbert County High School, the Granite Bowl, where he plays his games. Obviously, you know the connection when it involves Mecole Hardman there from Elbert County. So fun stuff with Georgia getting a commit out of Elbert County, and we'll learn a lot more about Marlon Dean here coming up in just a minute. I also have some time to get your questions and comments in. So whether it's on the BA Q&A or kind of anything else, we'll give you a chance to weigh in on that topic here right now on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. And later on, I've got some pretty good SEC stuff I want to get to. The name Marshawn Lloyd has been used with a comparison to a Georgia running back there at South Carolina. We'll tell you about that. So we just got a busy show all the way around. As I said before, best of luck to the Lady Dogs in the SEC tournament today, and just have a busy weekend for UGA athletics, which we will cover here as well. Eric Fan says Scott Cochran must have been doing something right for Saban to give him a raise when UGA went after them the first time. Yeah, I mean, it's just the classic, almost like political type story where, you know, Saban seemingly had done everything he could over the years to keep Scott Cochran, giving him huge raises. He made more money as a strength and conditioning coordinator at Alabama than some FBS head coaches make. And obviously, according to this AL.com story, also worked to try to keep Cochran from leaving even this time. And yet the moment that he's gone, all of a sudden we have the narrative emerge of what Cochran wasn't doing as strength and conditioning coordinator for Alabama and what Saban wants to be different now moving forward. I mean, this is the classic hypocrisy of every politician you've ever seen who changes a position on a moment's notice and starts saying something completely different than they've said in the past, new messaging. I think Saban's kind of guilty of that here for a moment. By the way, Sandy Price brings up an interesting name in terms of 2020 recruits that Georgia could have signed, maybe would have signed. Tank Bigsby is the name Sandy mentions. I don't like the stories about his recruitment, if true. Yeah, there were some things that Tank said around the time of his recruitment in terms of how he felt like he was treated by Georgia that don't sit well with me either. You know, I think that all is well that ends well. I think Georgia's got itself two good running backs. I think Dejon Edwards is a nice addition to the class. And yet there was a time when I was really hopeful that Georgia would sign Tank Bigsby and really felt that Georgia ought to have been pursuing Bigsby more than it was. And I think that Bigsby probably felt that there as well. So this is one of those that if it works out for him at Auburn the way that some people think that it will, the way that Bigsby himself thinks it will, then it's not going to be a great look for Georgia necessarily unless the running backs that recruited instead of him go on to great success. And obviously the Zach Evans thing kind of factors into all that there as well. Jennifer Caldwell Sperlin says, I think I missed half the podcast by reading all the comments. Either way, Jennifer, we're just glad y'all are having a good time. Mike Mazzell says we're going to have a high-scoring offense and an all-around overall crush-'em defense. But we should win it all. I'll also remind you that I wrote a piece at DawgNation.com along those lines yesterday about some of the things that Chuck Smith said when he was on our show on Wednesday about Georgia's need to kind of upgrade its pass rush and how that happens. If you're going to be that all-around crush-'em defense, to use your phrase, then being more impactful in the backfield is, I think, an important part of that. And that's what Georgia's going to be looked to doing here in this upcoming season. Bob Garrison on my subject of pro wrestling says, how about a Texas death match? You know I'd love that. Matt Talley says the new strength and conditioning coach at Alabama looks like an Austin Powers villain. I think that's pretty funny. Bradley Spalding says, how do I get the podcast on Spotify? I think if you just go to Spotify and search for DawgNation Daily, you should be able to find it that way. So hopefully it's as simple as that. I think it should be. Let me know if it's not. Graham Nicholson says it's cool to get an Elbert County commit today. Trey Scott getting his rep going. Go Dogs. Yeah, I think that Trey's made quite a name for himself as a recruiter as of late. It's nice to see him active already for the 2021 class as well. Michael Nelson says that Saban cares more about the strength of his program than his coach's future career opportunities. And yeah, Michael, that's the way it comes across to me as well. And I would even take it a step further. To me, it's not just Saban caring about the strength of his program. I would almost take it as Saban caring about his own personal ambitions more than the ambitions of the people working with him. And you've got to find a way to balance that. You've got to find a way to create the kind of organization where others can thrive. If the only person that thrives in an organization is the head of the organization, that organization's head is not going to have very good people working with them for very long. And by the way, Look at what Alabama fans have said about their recent defensive coordinator, recent comments about Pete Golding, what they once said about Tosh Lapoy. All of those things along those lines. Look at some of that, and I think you get a real indication of kind of maybe Nick Saban dealing with some of those same kinds of things right now. So I'm going to take more of your comments. We will also get Jeff Sintel here coming up in just a moment. At least I'm hopeful of that. Jeff today, unlike him, not to be ready to go here, but we'll figure all that out. We'll get that taken care of. Let me also get some YouTube comments here as well. I got Facebook pulled up. Let me get some YouTube comments, and we'll give you all a chance to kind of weigh in on this as well. Let's see what's going on over here on YouTube. All right, on the YouTube side of things here for a moment. Good to have folks checking in. Bama Boy says that Kirby's just like Saban. He's cut and dry with the media, LOL. So a little back and forth kind of going on over here. Word Nam says that Tennessee's going to be good this year. That offensive line is stacked with a senior quarterback. It's funny. I agree with the first part. I'm not quite so sure I agree with the second part. I definitely feel like the Tennessee offensive line can end up being one of the actually kind of interesting stories in the SEC, whether it be Trey Smith deciding to stay at Tennessee, seemingly in full health now, some of the recruits they've had. Jeremy Pruitt's probably recruited the offensive line position better than any other spot thus far. Guys like Wanya Morris and Darnell Wright. So they've got some depth. They still have, I believe, Brandon Kennedy, the former Alabama graduate transfer who had 2 years to play Tennessee. So he'll have his final year of eligibility. There's a good bit of quality depth for that Tennessee offensive line at the moment. You say they're going to have a senior quarterback. I'm assuming you're giving the nod there to Jared Garantano. I wonder if Garantano's going to hold that job for the full year. He very well might. I had relatively high expectations for him coming into last season, and for the most part, I'm not quite so sure that he lived up to all of those. You've got Harrison Bailey, the incoming freshman. Given what I've seen from Bailey, working in a really good high school offense at Marietta the last couple of years, I wonder if Bailey eventually unseats Garantano as the Tennessee quarterback going into the season. I wonder about that. Jalen Jackson says that Nick Saban has become the blame everyone else coach. That works when you're winning championships, but the moment they go on a drought, the fans will turn on them. I think that's absolutely true. I think that you can only scapegoat so many people before eventually the folks that you're trying to grift with those accusations eventually turn on you. When you lost the 2018 national championship game, it was very easy to say, well, if it wasn't for Tosh Lapoy, we would have won. Speaking of Saban, I made a mistake in even hiring him, and now we're running him out the door, and everything's going to be fine and better. And they bring in Pete Golding in his place, and then it's Pete Golding who's getting scapegoated for all the problems in Alabama. And Alabama fans say, well, if they can just get rid of Pete Golding and replace him with Charlie Strong, who's now working there as an analyst, everything's going to be fine. You only get so many of those in life before eventually people just sort of get tired of it and they kind of turn on you. And watch the way that former Alabama players have supported Scott Cochran since Cochran took the Georgia job. They've stepped up for him. They've spoken on his behalf. And look at those Twitter mentions. Look at the way that Alabama fans have turned on the former Alabama players who dare speak well of someone that dedicated his life to helping them grow personally, physically, and everything else. Alabama fans ripped their own because they dared to speak up and support Scott Cochran. Those same Alabama fans will turn on Nick Saban just as quick if things don't go well this season. That's one of the reasons why my prediction of Georgia beating Alabama twice this year, if that does indeed happen, I think watching the way that Alabama fans respond to that, it'll be really, really fun for a lot of us to see. Let's get a couple more here. Alex Johnson says the Dogs gained the mental edge when hiring Scott Cochran. That could be true. We'll see about that. Frank Patterson, the subject of our BA Q&A, says, another 2020 recruit I wish we would have gotten was the lineman that went to Florida after the Pittman departure. Him, Tank, and Rick Gilbert. So Joshua Braun's the name you're mentioning, who did go back to Florida. He was he was from the state of Florida, ended up choosing Florida after the Sam Pittman thing. And that's an interesting name. We'll see how his career develops. The other name that you mentioned is one that's, if I had only one on my list, it would be a Rick Gilbert. I just think that I think he's a spectacular prospect. And I think that he's interesting in so many ways. What he would have the potential of doing, not that Darnell Washington can't do a lot of these same things himself. There was just something about Gilbert, and it could very well be that I just saw more of Gilbert because he was from Marietta. But what I saw from him, I thought was really impressive. Really impressive. GB2 says, what are some of the key pieces we need to recruit top-ranked players for 2021? I think a lot of the real action for the 2021 class is going to be on the defensive side of the ball. When you think about what you're about to lose with guys leaving the program. Georgia has been able to kind of focus on the other side for a little bit, last class certainly, but there are going to be a lot of defensive names primarily discussed here because of the guys who are about to leave the program. That's why, Tony Grimes going to get mentioned, so much. Guys like that, Smile Mondon, who I hope you get a chance to talk to Jeff Sintel about today. There's going to be a lot of action for Georgia on the defensive side of the ball, multiple linebackers. Obviously, Georgia always looks to sign multiple defensive backs. Georgia gets a defensive lineman today. But a lot of the action for Georgia in its 2021 class is going to be, I think, featuring defensive players because that's where a lot of the subtraction is going to be going from the program after this upcoming season. I mean, look at the NFL Scouting Combine as the perfect example of this. The guys that were there for Georgia were offensive guys. The only defensive guy that was there was J.R. Reed. So from that standpoint, when you think about future NFL Scouting Combines, the expectation is you'll see a lot more defensive guys, which means they'll need to be replaced. So nothing from Jeff Sintel. Really weird. We don't have any insight on him whatsoever on that. All right, so I guess what we're going to do at this point in time is get ready to move on with the show and hope we can catch up with Jeff Sintel about that. Georgia did get a commitment today with Marlon Dean. Jeff's also written some really good stuff with Jared Zirkle, the Georgia kicker, Smile Mondon, as I mentioned, the Georgia linebacker. So a lot to hopefully get a chance to cover with Jeff. We'll look forward to doing that a little bit later on. Before that, though, let me kind of deal with some of the SEC stuff that's out there. I'll preview the upcoming weekend for Georgia Athletics and just kind of deal with all of that as we roll on here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
And, of course, we get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of our friends at Royal Caribbean. I want to tell you one of the things that I think makes a Royal Caribbean cruise so much fun. It's the things that happen while you're on the ship. And the entertainment is just unbelievable. It's, I'm talking about like awe-inspiring Broadway-style musicals, the kinds of things that you'd have to be, literally walking the streets of New York City to be able to see most of the time. Or the performance drone shows, their ice skating shows on the certain ships, the Oasis class ships. You get the Aqua Theater shows. You got high wire trampoline, just all kinds of crazy entertainment. The Aqua Theater shows, especially when you have the folks like, it's like Olympic-style diving on a ship that's moving at sea. That is not an easy thing to pull off, but they somehow make it happen. Royal Caribbean's been awarded Best Entertainment by Travel Weekly Readers' Choice Awards, so they've obviously been honored for the entertainment they provide. And when you check out a Royal Caribbean cruise, you're going to know that and see that for yourself. So contact your travel advisor and say, BA was telling me we have a good time on a Royal Caribbean cruise. You will, and they'll set you up for that. Or do me a favor and reach out to my friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority. You can hit them up at 800-326-4971. That's 800-326-4971. And let them know that you heard about them with us right here on DawgNation Daily. All right, a couple things to get to. I saw where J.C. Horn, the South Carolina defensive back, now Horn's a good player, and that's a guy that, kind of an interesting recruitment. At one point in time was committed to Tennessee, ends up going to South Carolina, a pretty good player. And he was also being asked to talk, South Carolina spring practice is already going on, and he was being asked to talk about, hey, what have you seen from Marshawn Lloyd thus far? And one of the comparisons that he made, based on the way that Lloyd's been moving in practice, was what he saw when he faced DeAndre Swift when South Carolina played Georgia this past season. So pretty high praise already for Marshawn Lloyd in the South Carolina uniform. Now, I don't have to tell you what the relevance of all of this is. This has been one of the real things that's really held the Gamecocks back. Now, we all know that South Carolina had a great game against Georgia this past season, but for the most part did not have very good games against really anybody else. Got jobbed by the officials against Florida probably, but other than that, a lot of bad games for the Gamecocks. And since Will Muschamp's been the coach there, the one consistent refrain is they have not been able to run the football. And the last couple of years had to do a little bit more up-tempo style, and sometimes when you're playing that way, it can inhibit your ability to run the ball. Mike Bobo, the new offensive coordinator, a guy that by the time he left his time at Georgia had really fully committed himself to running the ball, Bobo says quarterbacks playing under center more this year. That would seem to be a nod in the direction of running the ball a bit more. Lloyd's the kind of recruit that you can kind of build something around. So we're going to find out for ourselves here coming up pretty soon. Is J.C. Horn right, and is Marshawn Lloyd really the caliber of a player like DeAndre Swift has been? At one point in time, it was a name a lot of Georgia fans had circled in their hopes for the 2020 class. Never really quite happened, though, once we got into the real key months of the 2020 cycle. He is a South Carolina Gamecock, never really wavered in that choice, and apparently the Gamecocks seem pretty happy to have it. So I thought that there was a very interesting profile at CBSSports.com. Dennis Dodd was the writer. A very interesting profile of Eli Drinkwitz, the new Missouri coach. Now, Drinkwitz is one of those guys that has said a couple of interesting things already since becoming Missouri coach. And by the way, you see if you're watching on video, you see the video of one of the recruits they got that kind of went viral of a huge celebration from him about, an interesting recruit going back to National Signing Day. There is one thing that Drinkwitz seems to have as a little bit of a chip on his shoulder for the moment. Drinkwitz did not play college football. He's one of only a small number of guys that didn't play college football. And in the interview with Dennis Dodd kind of asks him about Barry Odom being replaced and the fact that Odom was not just a college football player, but a good player at Missouri. A lot of Missouri fans didn't feel like he should be fired. And Drinkwitz's quote is something to the effect of, hey, I don't want someone doing heart surgery on me that has had heart surgery. I want a trained surgeon. Essentially suggesting that he's somehow more equipped to do the coaching job than the average former player. I don't know if this was just clumsily written by Dodd or what, but the way in which the sentences kind of flow together, it almost makes it seem like Drinkwitz is taking a shot at Barry Odom. Now, you can read it for yourself and decide. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but there was certainly a weird cadence to all that made it seem like he was more equipped to be Missouri coach than Barry Odom was. And obviously, they wouldn't have hired him unless they thought that was true. But it was just sort of clumsily either phrased by Drinkwitz or written by Dodd. This is also, by the way, the same coach that recently took a little bit of a shot at Ole Miss and some recruiting tactics in the past. Drinkwitz may be one to watch. He doesn't necessarily look the part of what I've come to expect an SEC coach to appear to be as when it comes to the overall look. He said a couple of weird things thus far. Prior to him being hired, when he was at Appalachian State, I couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. But as it stands right now, a pretty interesting couple of months here on the job for Eli Drinkwitz there at Missouri. By the way, one of the things I keep wanting to talk about in our show and haven't had time to yet is the piece that Heather Dinich wrote at ESPN.com about Florida being the biggest threat to Georgia in the college football playoff. It's interesting. I think there's worth debating. I'm going to do that, I guess, probably on Monday's show. There is something else from the Dinich story at ESPN.com that I want to mention. Is the fact that on her list of like playoff contenders, there were only how many? 1, 2, 3 SEC teams mentioned. It was Alabama, it was Georgia, it was Texas A&M. A&M because of where they're ranked in the way too early top 25 for ESPN. So no defending national champion LSU, no Florida, even though Florida fans will tout themselves as a return to glory here this season. Lousy stinking Gators didn't get a mention from Heather Dinich in terms of playoff contenders at ESPN.com, and for that matter, neither did Auburn either. So kind of an interesting on a list like that to see who was not included. And I guess we'll make that cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. All right, it's DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger here today. A little bit of a weird thing for us. We have lost Jeff Sintel. Jeff normally with us on Friday. It's one of the staples of our program, and yet Jeff has not been with us thus far today. So let me do this instead. I was going to ask him our BA Q&A questions. I will ask you, though, in his place and give you a chance to weigh in on this, whether it be on video. I'm going to read a couple from the DawgNation forum. I may hit up my own tweets on this a little bit, too. So we'll allow you to kind of step in. And instead of me interviewing Jeff, I'll interview you as of sorts. So I shared these earlier. Let me share them one more time. We talked about the Scott Cochran stuff off the top of the show. Do you think that Nick Saban did Scott Cochran wrong? I told you about Eli Drinkwitz a moment ago. Who do you think the most interesting SEC coach is? I'm curious if we get a big flood of Mike Leaches on this or Lane Kiffin. I'm not sure I would pick either one of those as my answer. And I talked about Marshawn Lloyd a moment ago as well. So in honor of that, which 2020 recruit do you wish UGA would have signed? So we'll give you a chance to kind of weigh in on all of those. I'll go back to YouTube. I was doing some video-only stuff on YouTube a little earlier, so I'll do some of that here right now. Kenneth Newberry, by the way, says, don't be surprised if Newman doesn't start, and that would be a good thing for the Dogs. Boy, Kenneth, I'm not sure I agree with that on either front in terms of Newman not starting, nor if he doesn't start, that being a good thing for UGA. That's no disrespect to Carson Beck or Dwan Mathis or really any of the quarterbacks that you might mention there. I just think that the Joe Burrow success from a year ago shows you that experience really matters. And Jamie Newman's got it. That's why he's my guy for Georgia quarterback here this season. Light Dog 1968 says that he thinks that Mike Leach is the most interesting coach in the SEC, and he also thinks that Noah Sewell is the 2020 recruit that he wishes Georgia would have signed. I think those are all good answers. Leach is going to be a name that gets mentioned a lot, and I understand the kind of, I guess, mercurial nature of Leach and the Pirate stuff and all the things that he said when he was Washington State coach. I've told you before that I don't think that act's going to play as well in the SEC. I think for me, it's someone like Ed Orgeron. The more I learn about Orgeron, the more fascinated by him I become. Because it's almost as if everything on the outside of him is like a facade that allows him to do the real serious work behind the scenes. We've had a lot of folks on the show who know Orgeron personally, who've spent time with Orgeron, who've seen him and the way that he works with a program, and they'll tell you that he may come across as this like fun-loving, gregarious cartoon character type, but behind the scenes, he is a real, legitimate football mind and a very respected figure behind the scene on all of that. So, listen, I think that's for me, I just kind of see, Orgeron is more authentically interesting than someone like Leach. By the way, Casey on the DawgNation forum, and we always post these at forum.dawgnation.com as well, he also mentioned Noah Sewell. I did see where Sewell got the number 1 there in Eugene for the Oregon Ducks. So obviously that's typically a number you give to someone you have big expectations for. So as of now, Sewell is kind of one of those guys. And, it's always going to be tough. Georgia's proven itself to be a truly successful national recruiting program, but it's always going to be tough to kind of, go get a guy like that who had such a strong tie to Oregon. His brother's a great offensive lineman there, but couple names for Sewell so far, and I'm guessing as we continue to take some responses to our BA Q&A, we'll continue to get a lot more of those. Let me also now get ready to preview the weekend, courtesy of our friends at Kroger. We call it our Kroger Kickoff, and obviously when we think about the weekend, I got baseball practice a couple days. That means you're getting snacks together, you're getting drinks for everybody and things like that. A lot of you have very different weekend activities. You got folks gathering on a back deck or a front porch or around a fireplace somewhere, whether it be party or kids or whatever else. Kroger's just a great way to get stocked up for what you need for the weekend. They're also a great source for us to help preview the weekend for Georgia athletics. And it is busy. There's a lot going on right now. I mentioned around the time we go off the air for our live show, the Lady Dogs will be in the SEC tournament against South Carolina after a nice win the other day for Joni Taylor's team. The step up in competition is significant when it comes to the South Carolina Gamecocks, so keep your eye on that at noon. Diamond Dogs all weekend after a loss this week to Georgia Southern and a nice weekend the weekend prior to that in sweeping Georgia Tech. They'll be back in action against UMass here this weekend. Men's basketball concludes its regular season at LSU on Saturday. The Gym Dogs also at Alabama on Saturday, so be paying close attention to that. You've got men's and women's tennis against Ole Miss today. Softball is in SEC play now. They've taken on South Carolina as well, and this always seems like a really fun event to me. The women's tennis team, Darius Rucker, the famous country musician, lead singer for Hootie and the Blowfish, has a event that he does every year. He hosts a women's collegiate tournament that's going on this weekend. Darius is a big golf guy. Obviously, you know him, kind of connected to that South Carolina community, and he does this Monday after the Masters and things like that. Well, he also does a women's golf event as well, and that goes on this weekend too. So a lot going on for UGA Athletics here this weekend as we're on our Kroger Kickoff presented by our friends at Kroger. And, of course, something else to be aware of this weekend. Tomorrow, the first edition of Kroger Chef Jr. for the month of March. The menu item to be made is the dumpling sandwiches. And when you sign up, you get a patch, a recipe card, an apron, a chef hat, a recipe box, and a dumpling maker. And if you can't make it tomorrow, it's also available on March 21st as well. Just go to KrogerChefJr.com for more details about this. And by the way, the word junior spelled out, Junior, for those of you in the podcast. KrogerChefJr.com to register for your chance to be a part of Kroger Chef Jr. here tomorrow or later on March 21st. So we'll get ready to wrap up this edition of DawgNation Daily, and if we're able to catch up with Jeff Sentell, we'll slap it back into the show and just kind of, figure out what's going on there after that. So we'll be maybe a little disjointed, out of whack here today. So we'll figure that out then. Hope all of you are getting ready to enjoy a great weekend. We appreciate you being a part of our program here today, and whichever UGA athletic event you may be watching this weekend, in addition to, following everything that goes on with the football program, we hope you enjoy that as well. Something I know that you enjoy, and something I'm always proud to kind of close out our show and close out our week talking about. How about the Gatorhater update? Our buddy Eddie's on the desk with us each and every day. The blind squirrel holding up that Gatorhater sign as a reminder for all to know the rivalry that matters for Georgia more than any other. No matter what Alabama does, the Georgia-Florida rivalry is still the one that matters, and it's good news on that front, as it's now been 1,224 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten Georgia. It's our Gatorhater updater on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. And on video. Great to have all of you with us. As we get ready for our R.S. Andrews cooldown, we will talk to you about anything you want to. Obviously, the BA Q&A, I'm always interested to get your thoughts on that, and we'll allow you to do that, but also pretty much open for anything. The purpose of the Q&A, in some respects, is just to provide some structure to our conversation. But beyond that, you can kind of weigh in on anything you want to there as well. Bradley Spalding says, how often is Spotify updated the podcast? So it should work the same way the Apple Podcast player does, where it updates it every time we send it in. Like the podcast, if you're watching live on video right now, the podcast does not get posted until the show is done. I literally take the recording of us talking right now, and I put that up on SoundCloud, and from SoundCloud it goes to Apple, and it goes to Google, and it goes to Spotify and everywhere else. So it takes a little while for this show to show up, but it's typically updated by 11:30 or noon every single day. Typically not too much later than that. By the way, huge thanks to R.S. Andrews making the R.S. Andrews cooldown possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. R.S. Andrews can do all those things for you. Those issues behind the wall, those systems behind the house. I don't know how they work. You don't know how they work, but R.S. Andrews, our team over there, including our buddy Dari, they've devoted their entire life to understanding how those systems work and helping you if one of them in your house is not working the way that it should. So make sure you check them out online at rsandrews.com. Gary Westmiller says, do I think that Gunnar Stockton's going to commit to Georgia? Here's one thing that's interesting with the Stockton timeline. According to what Jeff Sentell said on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger on Wednesday, that Stockton could be ready to make his decision before the upcoming season, like before the start of what will be his junior season right now. Now, we know, at least I assume, that South Carolina is a pretty big factor in the Gunnar Stockton recruitment. Gunner's high school coach is J-Bo Shaw. J-Bo's brother, Connor's a former very good South Carolina quarterback, now working as a Gamecock staffer. So there's a tie there. Stockton has a little bit of a tie to the Bobo family. Mike Bobo is, of course, offensive coordinator. So I would probably take South Carolina pretty serious in Gunnar Stockton's recruitment. But if Stockton were to make the commitment to South Carolina right now, he doesn't really know what the future of the Gamecock program is going to hold. If South Carolina has a losing season, and there's a very strong possibility they might, if they were to have a losing season, then Will Muschamp may get blown out. Mike Bobo may be gone. Now, maybe that puts more pressure on them to put pressure on Stockton to get him to pledge as a way of holding out some hope for the future. Maybe that's the case. But the timeline of what Stockton apparently has planned, given what we think of as some of his competitors, I would say Oklahoma's probably in there as well, as they are for a lot of the top quarterbacks. Brock Vandagriff was a one-time Oklahoma commit. So the interesting thing for Stockton right now is when he's planning on committing. Jeff's suggesting it could come sometime this summer. If that does come with so much unknown about some of the would-be contenders for services, wonder how that impacts things. Let's see what else is going. James Crump says he thinks that Stockton will go to South Carolina if Muschamp is still there. He very well might. Matt Rukvina says that Jeff's comms have been jammed by nefarious forces. That could very well be. He said, Jacob O'Neill says it could be filming a hair gel commercial. You never know. Bob Garrison, by the way, mentions Jordan Birch as the recruit he wishes Georgia would have signed. That's a pretty good name there as well. Pretty good name. Matt Talley says Stockton gets to watch a full season of whoever wins the job next year before he makes a decision about Georgia. So I think that based on, and you can read the Stockton story at DawgNation.com, I think based on his own words there, and we have no choice but to take him seriously on this, I think on the basis of that, Gunnar Stockton has not come across to me as someone who's all that concerned about competition. I think for the most part, and this is a cliche, but it is true, for the most part he knows that he's going to have competition wherever he goes, that he's going to be dealing with that. And so the presence of a guy like Brock Vandegrift or a Dwan Mathis or a Carson Beck, given what I think I've learned about Gunnar Stockton, that doesn't seem like it's going to scare him off. Stockton comes across to me, there's a video interview that Jeff did with him. Stockton comes across to me as exactly the way that you'd want your big-time recruit to be, because there's almost like no ego there whatsoever, at least in terms of his outward expression. He doesn't, necessarily say a lot. A lot of recruits don't, but, it's just kind of, it's very modest. It's very mild-mannered, and I don't think he's coming into Georgia, if he were to come to a place like UGA, kind of as a swashbuckler saying, everybody out of my way, I'm here to be the quarterback. But I think that kind of calm demeanor also would allow him not to be intimidated by someone else's presence either. So I take it pretty seriously that Stockton's not that worried about competition, because most of the schools that he is going to be considering are going to have quarterbacks from the previous cycle. So I would say keep that in mind when it comes to Gunnar. Jacob O'Neill says the Braves have a spring training game at 1 p.m. on ESPN. That's fun. Ready to see some, I won't do a ton of Braves talk, but a little bit of a slow spring start for Osuna. Would like to see that. Obviously, you're hoping for better health news coming up soon on Freddie Freeman. There are a couple of Brave stories that I'd like to see evolve here. Sonia Prescott mentioned the kid from Hillgrove. I'm assuming that's Miles Murphy. That was, potentially a miss for Georgia. One thing about Murphy is he's such a different position fit, probably more of a position fit for Clemson as a 4-3 defensive end than at Georgia, who runs, more of the 3-4. But definitely he was a very big-time player. He's one of those guys that I would have loved to kind of see in that kind of like athletic, sort of defensive tackle role, putting a little extra weight on him, turning him into an athletic defensive tackle. That would have been really fun to see for Miles Murphy, but it's a little bit less of a high profile, a little bit of a less sexy position in some ways, and it's not necessarily a huge surprise that Murphy would have rather have the glory position of the legitimate pass rusher at a place like Clemson. John Arena says it'll be a huge miss if we don't get Stockton. And I guess I'm kind of the mindset that it's a lost opportunity for sure. And I mentioned this on the regular broadcast yesterday, just given how deep Georgia has been at the quarterback position. I'm sorry, the state of Georgia, not University of Georgia, the state of Georgia. Georgia has been a very deep state at producing, not the deep state, but a deep state at producing quarterback talent as of late. And, given all of that, I just think that tapping into that for future classes, making it a tradition of, hey, the best quarterback in the state of Georgia goes to Georgia. If you can find a way to do that, right now, you've got yourself a quarterback every single cycle, and you're going to pretty much always have a good one if that's what's going on there. So I do think that's important. And Georgia, unfortunately, years ago probably had the opposite of that reputation. Best quarterbacks leaving the state, Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, people like that. It'd be nice to reverse that for a future cycles. I think that'd be a really good thing. Travis Baltziger also mentioning Evan Pryor. Pryor's not one of these guys. I feel like we're in a little bit of a recruiting lull right now. I feel like there's not, with all due respect to the commit that Georgia got today, but for the most part, we're not like in this like crazy news cycle for recruiting right now. But I think Evan Pryor may announce sometime in April. I think that James Williams, am I right about this, that he's got kind of an accelerated timeline right now too? So Pryor may be one of those guys you don't have to wait super long on, which would be nice because as it stands right now, we're in a little bit of a slow go for some of this kind of stuff. Let me see what this is. Can I read this comment? Yeah, Reginald Johnson said he met Miles Murphy's mom and that she said that Clemson was a better position fit, but she's still a dog at heart. Yeah. Listen, Georgia's good at winning over the moms, and you're not going to get every recruit even when you win the mom. You're not going to, but you're going to get a lot of them. So I take it as good news that Georgia recruited the parent well, even if it didn't finish with the player. And, I do get it. if you're a classic 4-3 defensive end, that's a kind of a glory position. Goodness knows they make a gazillion dollars when they go to the NFL and get all kinds of draft attention and everything else. So if you have a chance to be that, I do kind of get it. You know, I would have tried to argue something different as a way of getting him to come to Georgia, but that not being a winning argument, I sort of understand that there as well. Randy Hall thinks that Evan Pryor's an Ohio State lean. I think that Ohio State's going to be very difficult to battle for any big-time running back for the 2021 class because they need running backs so badly. They have just had a weird situation with running backs. They've whiffed on a ton of them. You'd have to follow Ohio State recruiting more closely than I do to fully understand why that happened, but they have just missed on a bunch of running backs. And I think running back stands as a major need. By the way, they're also dealing with lack of running back depth on the team right now. Master Teague, who you may remember as a one-time Georgia recruiting target, he's injured at the moment. So they've got recruiting needs at running back. They've got on-field needs at running back. So I would say that when it comes to the 2021 running back names to know, I would say Ohio State's going to be all over them because Ohio State has got a lot of early playing time to sell at running back at the moment. Elite GB says, I love women that live and love football. I hear you, Elite. I hear you about that, brother. Who are y'all mad at? I can't tell who y'all are mad at in here. I'm not even sure I want to know. Joe Barger says, my pick for the one we missed out on 2020 as a Georgia fan is Brian Brzee. Yeah, boy, that's tough. Pair him with Walker, Davis, Aziz, Wyatt, Rochester, other defensive line returnees. It's scary. Yeah, Brian Brzee probably is what I wish Miles Murphy could have been turned into, like a really athletic interior pass rusher and just big-time factor as kind of a three-technique type player. That's probably what Brzee is. That's tough. That's tough. Mike D says too many kids in the chat today. Sorry to hear that, Mike. Yeah. Once again, my advice to you on YouTube is y'all be liberal with who you block because we're not going to really block anybody unless it's, obvious that it needs to happen. For the most part, we're not going to block. But y'all be liberal with who you block, though. Absolutely do that. Scott Harris says, as far as coaches go, how can anyone not respect Saban? Due to him, the entire NCAA game has been elevated. Scott, I totally agree with you on that. If the word we're kicking around is respect, I've got great respect for Saban, and as you said, how could you not? But when the word becomes something different, change respect to admire. I respect Saban, but do I admire him? Do I want to be like him? Do I want Kirby Smart to be more like him? Would I want my kids to grow up and be like him? I'm honestly not sure that I would. And I think the example of the way that Scott Cochran has been allegedly treated is an example of that. I think that Saban is a great coach, but I'm not sure I think he's a good guy. And from the standpoint of that perspective, take Georgia out of it for a moment. The fact that Ed Orgeron has won the most recent national championship and the fact that Dabo Swinney won the one before that, I'm not an LSU fan, I'm not a Clemson fan, but I would say their presence as the last two national championship coaches for college football, I think, is a good thing. Because while they may never be quite as dominant as a coach as Nick Saban has been, their personality and demeanor, both two very different guys, but both aspects of that, the kind of fun-loving Ed Orgeron, the kind of homespun Dabo Swinney, I think that's a better direction for the coaching profession to go. I hope in the future more coaches emulate what Swinney does, more coaches emulate what Ed Orgeron does, than emulate what Nick Saban has done. I think that I've got two young children, and as it stands right now, they're both interested in sports. As they grow up and become more a part of sports, what kind of coach do I want to see them be around? Someone like Saban, someone like Swinney, someone like Orgeron. I think that Saban would be the last of that trio from a personality type that I hope my kids are coached by. From that standpoint, even though Kirby would probably credit Saban as his most important mentor up until this time, as Kirby goes into year 5 of being a head coach, there's an evolution that's bound to occur. I hope the evolution of Kirby Smart at Georgia takes him away from looking more like Nick Saban, because I think that'll be better for him personally. I think it'll be better for Georgia from an institutional standpoint. I think all of us, once we get started, me speaking to a microphone, people doing like that, you emulate the people that came before you. There's probably lots of audio recordings of me trying to do a bad imitation of somebody who's famous for doing something like this. There's probably a lot of that. And Kirby Smart kind of emulating Nick Saban, I think that's just a natural thing that's going to take place. But he'll be better in the future for acting a little less like Nick Saban, I think. Dabo and Orgeron, I think, are perfect examples of that. Let's see what else is going on. Jalen Jackson's, and we're going to get ready to go after this. I guess Jeff Sentell is just falling off the side of the face of the earth. Could be coronavirus. You never know. You never know. Marvin Miller says everyone's going to get the benefit of working with Scott Cochran because all the players are going to practice and be a part of special teams. I think Marvin's probably right about that. The former Major League Baseball union head, was that Marvin Miller? Was that who that was? That's not the same person, but that's the name that kind of makes me think about that. Somebody else. Yeah, Jalen Jackson says Rick Gilbert's the guy I wish would have gotten. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. That's a pretty good one. Good comment by Marvin. Good comment by Jalen. Dapper Dan says, hold on now. Kirby wasn't raised by Saban. His family made him the great man that he is, not Saban. That's probably true. But when you've worked with Saban alongside him as much as you did, there's obviously a lot of influences that Kirby's going to have. I mean, there's plenty of examples we can cite of the Georgia program kind of looking similar to the Alabama program in the first few years, but looking a little less like Alabama in the future. I think for Georgia will be a really good thing. I say this not to be funny. I mean this well. When the Saban-Alabama dynasty is finally toppled, when that statue comes tipping over, when that finally happens, that'll be good for the sport. It'll be a liberation of sorts, I think, for the sport. James Crump on Saban for the Dolphins exit. That was an interesting time for sure. I remember all that. Oh, look at this. How about this? At the last minute here, at the bell, Jeffson. Let me read Steven's comment, and then we'll get Jeff. He says, I hope the Diamond Dogs can make it to the College World Series. I live in Omaha. They've been waiting for them to make it, every year. So, Steven, checking in from Omaha, how much fun would that be to see the Diamond Dogs in the World Series there at your town? Steven, I hope that happens as well, and I'd love to be a part of that if it does go down. So, good stuff. That's our R.S. Andrews cool down. We'll kind of wrap up with this, and I'll come back and say goodbye. Our buddy Jeff Sentell is ready to go. He is here. So let's do that right now as a part of DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, Jeff Sentell on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. It would not be a Friday without him, and we're glad we were able to catch up with him. For a while there, it was a little touch and go. But, Jeff, thanks for finding some time for us today and being with us, and I hope that you are doing well.
Finished the drill, right? We closed. We came through late in the game with a cell phone signal, man. Hope everything's great. Sorry I taxed the vocal cords where you had to fill some showtime, man.
Well, talking's never a problem for me, so we got that done. But it's actually you who I want to hear from now. Georgia gets a commit today, Marlon Dean. I like the high school that he plays for. I like the size that he brings to the table, but I need more information than that. So tell us what Georgia is getting in its 2021 commit, Marlon Dean, the defensive lineman out of Elbert County.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm sure there's some math majors that's going to jump on this, but so he's from Elberton, but he's actually also from the city of Bowman, Georgia. So the odds of Georgia having two Bulldogs from that small, great little pocket of northeast Georgia known as Bowman, Georgia, are rather small, but that's reality right now. He's about 6'6", he's about 265. This was the first year he actually played D-line for Elbert County. Side note, if you guys have ever get the chance to go watch a football game at the Granite Bowl in Elbert County, you need to. That's one of the true bucket list stadiums of my life, especially at the high school level. But it was funny, Brandon, because as we wrote on DawgNation this morning, he put out a top 11 yesterday, and everybody that would be a math major, they noticed that, and they go, hold up a minute, there are 10 logos, and then there's Georgia. There's Marlon wearing the Georgia jersey in the middle of the edit. And that was kind of subliminal, because if there was a change that needed to be made, It wasn't from a top 10 to a top 11. It needed to be a top 11 to a top 1. It was kind of an eventuality that he was going to choose Georgia, and it ended up to be the case. And, you look at him, he looks like he's going to be a 5 technique right out the box. Real athletic young man. I was speaking to someone who knows him very well, and they compared him. Now, listen to this, Dog Nation, folks. They compared him to former Georgia Bulldog Kendrick Golston, who went on to play in the NFL for the Redskins for a lot of years. And just he has that type of ability, that type of frame. And that's a pretty good comparison right now in the early stages for junior Marlon Dean. That's another Peach State Bulldog, 3-star. He's rated. He was an all-state player. Cares a lot about going about his business the right way, both on and off the field. And the Georgia, I know, Brandon, you're going to love this, the Georgia class of 2021 is now up to 3 members, and all of those young men hail from the state of Georgia.
Yeah, you love the idea of that, and this is apropos of nothing, but you mentioned Golston. A lot of folks remember that DJ Shockley was injured and missed the Florida game in 2005. Golston was also hurt that day and not playing for Georgia. So a couple key injuries, Jeff, cost the Dogs that day against the Gators. Not that I'm still holding a grudge about that.
Definitely not. I don't see why anyone in our audience would wonder why that game would stick in your craw for a little bit, my man.
Speaking of sticking around, obviously a lot of Georgia fans hope that Jared Zirkel is going to be sticking around Athens for a while. I thought your piece with him was really interesting, and there's a lot about all of this I don't really know. You did a good job of explaining the blue shirt situation. Ultimately, I'm not a huge stickler for the rules, so exactly what the blue shirt was, that was a nice way of kind of, understanding when he'll arrive at campus and, kind of what all of that means. But beyond that, in terms of getting ready to potentially do a job like replace Rodrigo Blankenship, that's not an easy thing to do. Having spent some time with him, and I hope folks will check this story out at DawgNation.com, are you convinced that Zirkel's going to be ready to go come September? Are there other names we ought to be thinking about in this discussion right now? Is it a challenge for him not to arrive until, later on this summer? What do you make of the transition Zirkel's about to have to make and potentially stepping into a pretty prodigious pair of shoes, the ones and the specs, I guess, recently worn by Rodrigo Blankenship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a natural question. First off, the thing that's going to happen is he's going to be there in late May, early June when guys like Cedric Von Tron and Tate Ratledge and guys like that, Broderick Jones, will join the program. But Zirkel's just going to be paying his own way for about 3 months. And that means in August he will become a full scholarship guy, but he'll still be participating in team activities earlier than that. I think the thing to watch for with Zirkel is, that's probably part of the creative financing, I would say, or the creative scholarship cap room. Everybody remembers the contributions of Eli Wolf and Lawrence Cager, where those were graduate transfers who showed up in May, June. So those scholarships had to go towards the 2020 total, which means Georgia was definitely stretched to its limit in terms of available scholarships to bring in to put guys on scholarship immediately in the 2020 class, which finished number 1 overall. That means Zirkel's scholarship will count towards the 2021 class, and that's why he can't go on scholarship until August of 2020 as a blue shirt type candidate. I'm not going to bore anybody with the NCAA manual about that, but I think the big thing is this. Zirkel is going to have an amazing kickoff leg. It was NFL ready, NFL caliber, Power 5 caliber last year as a junior. Kickoffs are his strength, so I expect him to automatically contend and likely grab the kickoff specialist job, and that's a big deal for Kirby Smart about protecting his defense. And just think about that game in Tuscaloosa, Brandon. If you've got an automatic touchback machine, an ATM machine back there at kickoff, then you don't have to worry about the ball going into Jalen Waddle's hands on all those kickoffs. That's an important part. I think the work in progress for him is going to be the field goal, the technique, the accuracy on those place kicks. And, he's a little less confident about being the man right out of the box as the place kicker at the University of Georgia. I'm sure Jake Cremata will get a look, but he seems to be going along really well at punter right now and in a groove. Seems like he has a chance to be an all-SEC punter this fall, or at least has all the ability in the world to be, and he's going to have the experience to be that as well. Brooks Buse is a guy that was a preferred walk-on from Greater Atlanta Christian. He was a great all-state level kicker in the state of Georgia, but Brennan, you know as well as I do, when they bring these guys in, and Zirkel is set to go on scholarship, they want him to claim the job, they want him to win the job. And when you look at his resume, Brennan, he's kicked 50-yarders in games before. He's even kicked a 59-yarder in a game before. He tells me his max is probably 64, 65 yards.
But when it comes to the pressure of kicking in a triple-decker stadium, playing in the SEC, on national television, that can't be replicated in high school or in any level of play, prior to showing up at a place like Georgia, right?
Yeah, that's the main thing. It's not kicking a 60-yarder or kicking a 55-yarder or a 48-yarder. It's kicking that ball in front of 93,000 fans that want to be your best friend and want to start, coming up with a clever nickname for you, or that hate your guts and want to spew venom and vinegar at you whenever you try to trot on and trot off the field. I think the one thing that's indicative of maybe something to look for with some strong potential is just the way Jared Zirkle had to win the job. Kickers at Georgia have to go through some sort of audition, Survivor Series type thing where you've got to kick well with Kirby Smart watching you and all the special teams analysts and support staff there. And if you don't kick well with Kirby watching you, you're not going to get a scholarship offer. And Zirkle won the kickoff competition going away, but when it came to him making the field goals, he hit his first one and then missed 2 or 3 of his next field goal tries, and he got knocked out of the competition. And there reached a point, though, where certain kickers, and these had to be quality kickers that Georgia had been looking at, they brought them back with a sort of, last chance scenario where they had to make a bunch of kicks to stay in it. And then Zirkle made all of his kicks 4 or 5 in a row from 40 yards plus, and he finished in the top 8 there. So that was some really stern Constitution type stuff that Zirkle had to get through in order to even qualify to get that scholarship offer and accept that offer from the University of Georgia.
A few more topics I want to make sure we touch on because you and I actually haven't talked recruiting in this space in a couple of weeks. Smile Mondon, great piece with him at DawgNation.com. And in terms of competition for Georgia, I see Oklahoma show up in that story. I see Florida show up in that story. It sounds like the Gators are trying to recruit him pretty hard. Obviously, that's a high priority for Georgia. And yet, I have a hard time kind of deciding who I think Georgia's chief competition in that race would be. Smile seems to be a guy that keeps his cards pretty close to the vest and all this kind of stuff. And as you said, does not do a lot of the typical recruit tours that a lot of these guys go on and lead up to their, kind of time on the stage here in their recruiting cycle. So if I'm a Georgia fan that wants Mondon in Georgia, who should I be most worried about right now?
I think you're going to have to just look at the clock and look at the calendar because I think Smile only wants to make his decision after his senior year. He's going to work to enroll early. He'll be able to do that. 5-star prospect, number 3 linebacker. He's rated as an outside backer, but would be an inside backer for Georgia. He just wants to take his time, and I think some of that means that he wants to make sure recruiters keep coming around and bringing more exposure and checking out the other players on his team as well. He seems in no real big hurry to make his decision, and if I had to sit there and handicap the field for my good friend Brandon, it kind of seems like Auburn is making him a priority. There is a really good effort being done by former Georgia linebacker Christian Robinson for Florida. He's really established a connection with Smile, really established a connection with that Paulding County coaching staff. That's an area of Georgia that doesn't pick up a lot of players or doesn't send a lot of players to the next level. And Georgia's in there, Auburn's in there. Those seem like the schools that are in the midst there, right there. And I think Tennessee's also looking at a chance to try and get him on campus for one of his official visits as well. But I don't think Shmile's done anything in terms of, has any sort of plans in the near future to establish the top 12, the top 8, the top 16, or anything like that. The thing I like about Smile, though, and you guys should really pay attention to, is this is a young man, 6'3", 218. He triple jumps about 48, 49 feet. He has an 11-1 in the 100, really fast young man. And somehow he's a 5-star without going through any of the showcases, the Under Armour camps, the opening camps, the Rivals camps, any of these combines where people have to do to get noticed. He's became a 5-star prospect just based on his film and what he looks like physically and what he brings to the table physically. And in this day and age, that's definitely an outlier where you have a guy like Smile Mondon who's a 5-star but has really done very little to market himself other than send out game film.
We're going to talk about Gunnar Stockton here for a moment. I thought it was a very interesting piece with Stockton at DawgNation.com. Also a great video interview. A lot of folks saw that as a part of Before the Hedges presented by Kroger going back to this past Wednesday. And In our comment section, Jeff, sometimes people bring up the notion of Stockton and South Carolina. Obviously, Stockton's got a connection to the Bobo family. Mike's offensive coordinator there now. His high school coach is Jabo Shaw, the brother of the former South Carolina great Connor Shaw, who's also now a Gamecock staffer again. And on the show on Wednesday, you said that you thought that Stockton might be ready to make a pledge prior to the start of his junior season, which would only be a couple of months from now. That's also before we get a chance to see if Will Muschamp's going to do enough to save his job at South Carolina this year. So maybe focusing this much on South Carolina is a mistake when it comes to Stockton, but in terms of considering a school where the coach is definitely on the hot seat, how much pressure do you think he'd feel from a place like South Carolina to commit and make it a little easier to hold on to Muschamp or Muschamp to argue for him being held on to there in Columbia if things don't go all that well this season?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Gunner is one of those young men from, like, Northeast Georgia that just does things differently. Like, I think the phrase that always sticks in my mind about young Stockton is he wants to be married up to a school sooner rather than later. He doesn't want to go through all that investment of time. It's going to take a considerable commitment of time and effort and a relationship building in order to secure this commitment, because Gunner wants to be with somebody and commit somewhere where he goes, okay, this feels good in 2020, 2021, 2022, and I'm going to a place where it'll still feel good in 2023 or 2024. There are very few places that you can sit there and say that guy's at the job he wants to be, that guy's not going anywhere. And you have to start at the head coach level with guys like Kirby Smart, Dabo Sweeney, when you start thinking about guys like that. And, you know, Clemson's different. They haven't offered a 2022 quarterback yet. They're not offering a lot of 22 prospects in general because that's just the way Clemson gets down with their recruiting. They wait later than other schools. So you're going to look at it, and it's going to be awful hard for a guy like any of these offensive coordinators to say, you know what, Gunner, I'm recruiting you now, and I will be with you in your junior season, wherever, if you decide to come here, because that's just very fleeting. It's very hard for these coordinators and maybe some of these play callers and quarterback coaches to be able to say that. Of course, South Carolina has a chance with a strong year this year with Bobo and Muschamp to be able to do that. I just think that schools that have been recruiting Gunner Stockton for a long time now, or are in there right now, are going to be the ones he eventually chooses from. That's just my opinion there, because this family, the way they go about things, is they just value the little things. I don't see Gunner ever committing during a season to take something away from his high school teammates and the focus of his high school season. I don't even see Gunner going to an Elite 11 or an opening camp if that makes sure ensures he will miss some team workouts, some practices, or even something like weightlifting sessions. He's all about, this is a quote his father gave me, the thing that head coaches like about Gunner Stockton is they like wherever his feet are planted right now, that's what he's going to try to be the best at. And that's just the way Gunner goes about his business. You see the arm on film. He can chunk that thing 66 yards in the air. There are games on film where he's letting the ball go and the ball flies 60 yards in the air in an actual varsity game. That's the type of arm strength he has. You start thinking about things, and I put in that piece, Georgia's always going to be there because of the connection to Charlie Warner, how he felt about Charlie Warner. Charlie Warner brought him along to Georgia on a recruiting trip without parents when he was in the 6th grade. That's when Gunner was the ball boy for Raven County, and Charlie Warner was a senior taking a senior fall season visit as a committed prospect to the University of Georgia. He has an acquaintanceship with Jake Fromm. It was really funny how when he was going through Little League at East Cobb and Marietta, he exhibited poise, character, tough mental makeup, the ability to get things done during the clutch. And some of the coaches around the East Cobb program started calling him Little Jake because he looked like a little Jake Fromm. So there's a lot of connections there between Gunner Stockton and Georgia that I think ultimately is going to give Georgia a great shot at signing him in the 2022 class.
A couple more things, Jeff. We'll let you go. We appreciate your time today. I liked your reporting on Evan Pryor, the running back of the day. Sounds like he may be looking at an April decision date. I take that as good news, not even so much with Pryor as it is that, and I hate to be this way, but it seems like we've been in a little bit of a lull in terms of recruiting news. I know we've had a dead period, and that obviously impacts all of that, but I'm ready for some action again. Georgia gets to commit today. That's certainly a start to all of that, but whether it be Pryor or I guess maybe James Williams out there too, What is next in this 2021 cycle, and kind of what can Georgia fans, as we, head towards the end of March and into a spring practice in April, G-Day coming up, big visitors there. What are kind of some of these, I guess, next dates to know for all of this?
Yeah, so the recruiting calendar is open again. Quiet period means that coaches can't go on the road and see these guys, but prospects can come on campus and visit and tour. Evan Pryor is going to take a lot of unofficial visits in the month of March. I think he's going to visit North Carolina, Ohio State, and Georgia. I think those are going to be some telltale visits because they're still going to be unofficials, but he wants to make his decision in April sometime. He's told me April is the ballpark. And really credit to Evan Pryor because what he's doing, I don't know if he's going about it with this knowledge, but I don't know if he sits at number one on a lot of these boards of the schools he's looking at, but he probably sits 2 or 3 with a lot of committable offers on the table. So what he's going to do is go ahead and figure out his wall and get into a class and get into a place where he feels comfortable, while other guys are going to take a lot longer time to do so. So in some ways, he's going to set the curve on his recruiting instead of having other recruits and other dominoes set the curve on his decision. He's really fast. He's got that sprinter speed as well. He's a better fit for a Monken offense that likes to feature a running back in space. Made a lot of plays catching balls through the air out of the state of North Carolina. And very quietly, Brandon, there's a little bit of turf war going to go on between Georgia and with the 2021 class, especially in the state of North Carolina, because Mack Brown is an excellent recruiter, one of the greatest recruiters in the country, and he's got North Carolina pointed in the right direction. And there's a lot of names now. There's not just the Will Shipleys, but maybe even more core Georgia guys like a Jabari Ritchie, a Ra-Ra Dilworth, an Evan Pryor. Key battleground type prospects between Georgia and North Carolina, in the state of North Carolina, where the promise and present of Georgia is going to be recruited, and the prospects are going to have to consider whether that's rosier and that's sunnier than the future and what they're promising for the North Carolina Tar Heels in Chapel Hill. Very interesting couple of these head-to-heads Georgia's going to do with North Carolina in that state, which could help with some pretty big pieces and some pretty nice pieces potentially for Georgia in the 2021 class.
I've kept you long, Jeff, but do you have time to rattle through our BA Q&A here quick with some quick answers to some quick questions?
I'm going to go rapid fire.
So this is what we've been posing to the entire audience here today. I told the story of Scott Cochran and Nick Saban, as reported by AL.com yesterday. Of course, you had a great piece with Cochran also in the last week at DawgNation.com as well. Given what we've learned about Saban, maybe not allowing for professional advancement for Cochran and, frankly, not saying the most kind things seemingly on the way out the door, you think that Nick Saban did Scott Cochran wrong through all of this?
Good question. I realize why you're asking it, but no, I don't feel that way. I just feel like maybe Alabama didn't have the staffing element in order to give Scott Cochran what he needed. And Scott Cochran, when you know his agendas, he wants to be an on-field coach. He wants to be a head coach one day. He needed to go about finding a way to get that done, and that's a very comfortable spot to do that at the University of Georgia.
Who do you think the most interesting coach in the SEC is?
I think they're all in the SEC West, Brandon. I really do.
I do too.
There's still a little bit of unknowns right now between what will Leach be, what will Kiffin be. There's still a lot of unknowns right there. And then you've got the classic Ed Orgeron, who's now going to have a little bit of national championship swagger to his words a little bit. I think it's just really fascinating what's going on in the SEC West when you look at all those guys top to bottom. I mean, that media days are going to be classic when you've got Kiffin at the podium, you've got Coach O, you've got Mike Leach. I want to see how well Mike Leach thinks he can throw it around in the SEC, because if that offense is successful, he's going to have KJ Costello, who I think is the poor man's choice for the best returning quarterback in the SEC, even though he's not returning, but the best future number one starter in the SEC this fall. If Mike Leach can throw it around and move the ball in the SEC with his offense, he's going to become a lot more interesting for that SEC network.
And then finally, Jeff, on this one, which is the 2020 recruit that you think Georgia fans will probably most one day say that was the one that got away, the one that Georgia fans should probably wish their team had signed the most?
Definitely not Zachary Evans. I would probably keep going back to the easiest one there. You know, there's a little bit of Theo Johnson coming up in my mind, but I'm going to stick with Noah Sewell. I think he was a transcendent player for college football who's going to be a guy that's just going to do things for Oregon like Isaiah Simmons did things for Clemson.
Boy, that's a very, very interesting comparison. Jeff, thanks for taking the time to answer those. We appreciate you being here as a part of DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. Safe travels to you, and look forward to getting a chance to speak to you soon.
All right, Brandon, I got one thing, guys. You guys asked for it. I'm by no means Mr. Plug like my good buddy Brandon is, but I want you to perk the ears up a little bit. You guys asked for Before the Hedges. It's on SoundCloud. It's on Spotify. Coming soon to the iTunes platform. Big hat tip to Connor Riley on that one. But, Brandon, we've got the Before the Hedges Recruiting Podcast. It's right now on Spotify, SoundCloud, and coming to an iTunes platform near you.
Yeah, that's really good news, Jeff. That's long overdue and a good thing to have going on there. We'll look forward to watching every Wednesday, listening to you whenever, and, of course, talking to you here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger again soon as well.
All right, Brandon. Have a great weekend, man. Good hearing from you, buddy.
You too. That's Jeff Sintel there. Good stuff with him. We kept him long, but I wanted to cover a lot of ground, so we had not done that before. Huge thanks to all of you for being here as well as part of our R.S. Andrews cooldown. Also, make sure you check out the AJC for your Atlanta news now at ajc.com. Man, there is a lot to keep up with, whether it be the coronavirus stuff and things like that. Obviously, you can get very, very good up-to-the-minute information when you go to ajc.com for all of that. Also, a really interesting look at a lot of the really nice waterfalls around the state of Georgia. If you're looking to kind of get away and enjoy kind of nice road trip, weekend drive, ajc.com can cover that for you. The end of the Ant-Man era looms for UGA. Mark Bradley's got an interesting column on that. You can get all of your Atlanta news now at ajc.com. Make sure you check that out. And on the way out the door here, thanks for all your comments. Thanks to R.S. Andrews for making it possible. Y'all check them out. Water heater goes out, electrical issues, whatever you're dealing with, they can handle that for you. Find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday for DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.